Right. Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome one and welcome all. We are here today as part of Gorilla Presents, and as you can see from this lovely picture, we are here to talk about speech production online. I'm Joshua Bolsters. Unfortunately, our CEO, Joe Evershed, is not able to make it today, but hopefully I'm going to be able to take us through this, and we're going to have a wonderful discussion all about the great things you can do online with audio recording and speech production research. I can see the attendees flooding in. I can see we've got about 50 people here already, which is great. We're definitely expecting a few more, so we won't get started just yet. Just to tell you a little bit about what's going to happen today, for those of you who are here, we're going to start. I'm just going to do a little introduction, and then each one of our expert panel are going to then tell you a little bit about their research. They're going to tell you about what they've done in this area, their kind of background. They're also going to tell you about some of the challenges that they had moving online and how they overcame those challenges. At the end of this, we have a more general question and answer session. And if you have any questions throughout this, you can ask at any time. There should be a Q&A box, question and answer box, that you can use and fill in, and you can ask those questions. And if you like any of those questions, you can use the little thumbs up and you can upvote those questions. And we're going to be monitoring that throughout this session. There is also a chat box as well. And the one thing to warn you about the chat box, and I don't know why Zoom does this, by default, the chat only comes to us, the panelists, which isn't great. We want everybody to be part of this as much as possible. So when you're sending your messages, when you're typing in your messages, above that is a little blue box that says to, and by default, it probably says panelists. But you can change that to panelists and attendees. So then everybody can see what's going on. And what I'd like is just to get the ball rolling and get people, a bit more engaged. I want you to just tell me, all of you, tell me your name and where you're from. So I can just say here, I'm a really bad typer, but yeah, I'm Josh from Gorilla. As you can see, I'm a really terrible typer. Definitely, writing is not my forte. But yeah, so you guys, all of you here. So hi, Nada from Saudi Arabia. Oh, fantastic. Lovely to have you here. Oh, great. You've got a fan already, Emma. So that's really great. Emma had mentioned beforehand that she might be experiencing some technical difficulties. So we might have to do a shuffle around, but yeah, we'll see how that goes. Thank you, everyone. Who else have we got? We've got Shana from Ottawa. I can see people here from the Netherlands, living in Lancaster. Ashley from Birmingham, Marcus from Bristol. We've got people in, we've got a fan of Roger too. Okay, we've got all the fans coming in today. Fantastic. That's why we bring in you guys as a panel. We wanted you to bring in your fans. This is fantastic. Okay, great. So another thing, just kind of keeping up on the chat, another thing I would love to know is basically what made you guys embrace online research? What got you using Gorilla or any of the other tools that you're using? Tell me again in the chat. And by the way, remember, the default is messages to us. So if you want everyone to see, make sure to change it to panelists and attendees. Yeah, COVID-19, COVID. I'm spotting a theme here, pandemic. It does seem to be the big push, doesn't it? I think it seems to have been what got a lot of people into doing online research. I misread that. I just saw Emma's message, saying she's about to move into a different position with her laptop. I thought that was why she went on to online research, because she was going downstairs, which confused me. Great. So yeah, thanks everyone. And I'm just wondering as well, all of you you've started doing online research, can you tell me in the chat as well, are you planning to go back to lab-based now that we're opening labs, or are you going to stay online, or both? So type in lab if you're going exclusively back to lab-based, online if you're staying online. Yeah, both if you want to do both. So I'm seeing a lot of both, lab and online. Online for special populations. That's something we hear a lot about, actually. And I think for me, that was always a wonderful thing about doing this kind of online research, that you move beyond the weird population, the white, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. I think Somebody once said that psychology is the study of the brain and the mind of the white undergraduate psychology student. And I think it's great. Online research, for me, what I love is that you get beyond that and you start getting a much more diverse and realistic population. So one of the things that would be great to know as well about is, what challenges do you face that you're hoping to learn about today? Again, tell me in the chat. And if you've got specific questions related to those challenges, start putting them in our Q&A box. And like I say, we're going to kind of deal with this throughout this session as we're going through. So if you have any questions related to those challenges, feel free to ask. I can see timing accuracy. Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, actually. And I know we do, in fact, have a paper about timing accuracy in Gorilla. This is a wonderful paper that Alex wrote. And I'm not sure, Ashley, if you can find a link to the blog article on Insights and throw that into the chat, that'd be really helpful. Thank you, Ashley. Ashley is part of the Gorilla team, and she's going to be putting in links into the chat relevant to the things that we're talking about today. Accuracy of reaction time to the voice key feature. Yeah. Scoring. That's an interesting one. I think, Polly, I think you actually wrote one of the questions that hopefully we're going to have time to chat about later on in the Q&A. Okay, well, great, everyone. Thank you ever so much. So just a little, I guess, introduction for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with Gorilla. Gorilla's been around since about 2012, so 9 years now. This package has been developing and growing. And especially in the last 2 years, we've been trying to bring researchers together through things like our Be Online conference. Now, this year, Be Online is going to be in June, the 29th and the 30th. It's 2 afternoons rather than a full day, because we think that's going to be helpful for a lot of people. There are, links you can find on our Gorilla Twitter feed. There's also a new Be Online Twitter feed. And actually, if you can throw in the link to the Be Online conference, you can still submit abstracts if you want to have a poster there or give a presentation. We're going to be putting on an online program very, very soon. Now, the reason that we wanted to bring Be Online out there and do it is basically we wanted a space where all of you scientists could come together and you could share your insights about online behavioral research methods. We wanted a place where we could record these videos and just help to disseminate all of this information. But we've also been finding, especially as more people have been coming online, that having just one conference once a year in the summer actually isn't enough. The pace of online research is too rapid. So that's why we started doing this, Gorilla Presents. And we wanted to have this forum where we could bring together a panel of experts like our experts here today, and we could talk about the hot topics in online research, the things that you want to know about. And we wanted to share these kind of best practice methodology kind of questions and answers. So with that, just before we start, I want to put forward a little poll. And I just want to ask you guys, how much experience do you have with Gorilla, out of curiosity? And what is it, no experience? Is it something that you've started to play around with? It's something we're quite interested in knowing a bit more about. Oh, fantastic. It's always quite interesting. It seems like quite a wide distribution. I think actually there's quite a few people I can see today who don't have experience with Gorilla. Now, obviously today we're not exclusively talking about Gorilla. We want to talk more broadly about online research, but hopefully some of the things are going to be useful for you, whether you're a Gorilla user or whether you're using other packages. So today, as I said, we're talking about speech production online, and we know that this is a really popular topic. A lot of people who've moved on to online research are language researchers. And you can see previously we did a kind of auditory research lecture, which covered a bit about speech perception. And we're delighted today to get into more depth talking about speech production research. And I'm delighted now to take the opportunity to introduce our panel here. We've got Dr. Neil Kirk from Abertay, Dr. Emma Jones from Oxford University, Dr. Abby Bradshaw from UCL, and Roger Halper, who's here from Humboldt in the University of Berlin. And actually, if I could get each of you now to introduce yourselves in a bit more detail. We'll start with Neil, please.
Yep, I'm Neil Kirk. I am a lecturer in psychology at Abertay University, which is in Dundee in Scotland. I'm going to be talking predominantly about the language switching studies that I've done previously in the lab, but how I've converted them to online. And I think this is the way forward from the experiences I've had so far. So,
and we absolutely agree with you here at Gorilla. Emma, if you don't mind introducing yourself as well, please.
Hiya, I'm Emma James. I'm a postdoc at the University of Oxford. I'm actually more interested in the language side, so I'm interested in language learning. So I use these kinds of experiments to teach people new words and see how well they remember them. So that's how I use speech reduction. And I look forward to telling you a bit more about that in a bit.
Fantastic. And Abby?
Hi, I'm Abby. I'm a postdoc at UCL in Carolyn McGettigan's lab. So the research I do is interested in the voice and how we use and modulate our voices for different communicative goals. So I'm interested in how speech motor control is affected by processing of our own voice, but also of other voices, and how other voices can shape the way that we use our own voice.
Fantastic. And Roger?
Yeah, hi, I'm Roger, and I'm currently doing my PhD at Humboldt in Berlin. And well, first out of necessity, we obviously needed to change to online studies, and then it became sort of a project in and of itself, kind of replicating a standard effect in speech production and demonstrating that it can be done online. So that kind of evolved into a whole project in and of itself for now. So that was kind of exciting as well.
That sounds fantastic, and we look forward to hearing more about that as we're going through. So I think let's start now with the full presentation. So Neil, if I can pass over to you.
It's not letting me share while you are sharing.
My apologies. I will stop my share.
Am I good? You can see what I'm doing? Yeah?
Yeah, that looks great.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about my language switching research. The kind of crux or the core of my research involves speakers of minority, indigenous, non-standard and dialect varieties. I'm really interested in the types of language varieties that we don't think of as languages necessarily. We don't think of these speakers as bilingual necessarily, but they might still navigate more than one language variety. And I'm interested in sort of examining how similar that is to traditional bilingualism. So in most of my research so far has involved speakers in Scotland who speak a language variety or a type of language variety called Scots. Something like 1.5 million people in Scotland report speaking this. And it is recognised as a minority language, but for the most part, people just think of it as an English dialect, and it's a low status, for the most part, dialect. So to investigate similarities between how an individual uses this, I used a language switching paradigm and to investigate basically the cognitive representation and levels of dominance of these varieties and how quickly you can switch between them, and that indicates, how strongly the languages are represented. And our previous research has indicated that there's similar things happening between using these more closely related varieties that people don't think of as separate languages as traditional bilinguals use as well. So in the old world, I used to run these studies in our lab at Abertay. We would use software like ePrime, and we would have specialist hardware, so like the Kronos serial response box, to run these studies. So participants would be naming pictures, they'd be cued as to name it in this language this time if it's this color, name it in a different language if it's that color. And we would measure their response times and their accuracy as an indicator of the cognitive processes that are happening and the effects of having to mix languages versus using one at a time. So we would do these studies in the lab. We had sort of specialist software that had software licenses and particular types of hardware that we needed as well. I can just remember not that long ago that really limited how many of these studies we could run at a particular time, because we were limited by the space that we had. But even when we had equipment that was portable, we didn't have many, we didn't have a range of the same hardware. We had to kind of share it. So it did limit how much of this we could do at any given time. One of the benefits of doing that work through ePrime and its hardware was that we're interested in naming latencies or response times, and the ePrime and its hardware would automatically detect that. So it was measuring from when a picture appeared on the screen until the person started to speak and produce that utterance. However, we didn't, or at least I wasn't aware of how to do this. It wasn't actually capturing their audio. So we would have to record that separately and listen back at a later time to go back through and to code whether the participant had given the correct response or not. So that used to mostly just be a single audio file that might last 5 minutes as they're doing the whole task. And I would just sit back with my Excel spreadsheet, kind of going through trial by trial and coding that. Obviously, like everyone else, COVID has massively affected how, the capacity of doing this research. So for me, it was a case of last year, just kind of getting to grips with what paradigms that I currently use could I actually transfer online. I was actually amazed to discover that Gorilla had the feature for audio capture, because I just didn't think that these types of studies would actually go online very easily. So what I've now been able to do is to convert these paradigms for running online with Gorilla. And what it means is that now, instead of having to recruit participants to bring them in, participants can take part in these studies at home, which is obviously really good. It makes a big difference in terms of sort of resources and time and everything like that. How I now run these studies, so I obviously have put the paradigms together. The beauty of using it on Gorilla is I now have a set of templates or frameworks, and it's just mostly a case of updating the spreadsheets for different types of studies, maybe tweaking some of the instructions here and there. But once I'd got these up and running, and I am in the process of turning these into open materials, so I will share these with the wider community. I just have to finish doing that. But this has really just increased how quickly we can get new studies up and running. So I've had several of my students running versions of this, and with various different collaborators who are running lots of different types of these studies. One thing that I think is really nice about how Gorilla works is, unlike my old version, which was recording just on a recording device, a single file for the whole experiment, we now get trial by trial audio recording outputs. So to basically get that into data that an analyzable form, there's 2 steps that I now take after I have downloaded their audio responses. The first is that I convert their outputs and turn it into a new Gorilla spreadsheet, where I then upload the individual files into an accuracy coding task. So I've now created just a fairly simple way of just coding participants' responses. And in terms of extracting the naming latencies, I've been using the Cronset system, which is available at that website there. And what this is a case of converting the audio files into WAV files, uploading them in batches, coming back a bit later to my email to get the outputs with all the file names and their response times. So that has been a great way of getting that information. I then obviously combine all this with some R scripts that I've put together and can end up analyzing the data. I meant to remind myself to give a shout out. I'm relatively new to using R, but I've completely just got to grips with it from data wrangling for these purposes. And I actually owe Emma a bit of gratitude, because it was her blog that really got me started on it. So I'm not somebody that's been massively experienced with coding or programming or scripting or anything like that, but it's been more easier to get to grips with than I was expecting. So some of the benefits overall are how easy these have been to adapt, to use and to adapt. I don't use any scripting in my Gorilla tasks. I just everything's through the kind of drag and drop and the using the spreadsheets. So I don't use any scripting, even though that might make some of the parts of it a bit more efficient. What it allows for is for us to reach these harder to access populations or language communities. So we're no longer restricted to either going out into these communities or bringing individuals into the university, but we can actually access, people can access it online. So that really opens up the opportunities. And what I found with the studies that we've run so far is that data that we're getting is comparable with our lab studies. So I'm quite confident that the sort of data that we're getting online is pretty equivalent to what we used to get in the lab. We're finding that we're replicating lots of the same effects, and the data's in the same sort of ballpark and stuff. So it's pretty encouraging. However, one of I'd say the challenges is that we tend to have to throw a bit more data away than we were used to doing from the lab studies, because individuals obviously don't have the same level of control over the equipment that they're using. So sometimes we have a participant who just doesn't get recorded at all. Sometimes just trials here and there. It's not necessarily an issue with Gorilla, but sometimes with the Cronset system, even trials that I've coded as correct, because I can hear the response, don't get detected. The response time doesn't get detected. So we tend to lose more trials than we would have. But obviously the flip side of that is it's easier to recruit more participants to an extent, because one of the issues I've still found with online, I thought this was going to change everything. I thought we'd move from working with maybe a few dozen participants to hundreds of participants. I found recruitment to still be a bit of an issue. So just to give an example, I launched my project and website, etc., in December with a bit of media coverage, and was, did some radio interviews, some local press, and it actually led to 2 participants completing the study. One was out of the age range that we're actually looking for, and the other's microphone didn't work. So it didn't actually, recruitment is still an issue. It's still much more of an active process. On the flip side, some of the funding that I have, I ran a study where we were paying participants. I don't tend to use the third-party platforms because these participants are not necessarily represented on there, but I was able to complete a study in 3 days. So, recruitment is a bit hit or miss. Obviously, payment is a great incentive, but you obviously need to have funding for that. One of the things I didn't anticipate was this much more informal setting leads to much more informal behavior. So I've heard a lot of people chewing while they're doing the tasks. I've heard a few people burping, some yawning, some swearing, lots of dogs barking. So I think they forget sometimes that they're actually being recorded and that you will listen back. And some of the processes in this are still slightly time consuming. So my sort of dream would be that rather than me having to download their audio responses to re-upload into a new task, is that there was somehow a way for me to just, without can put them in the new task without me having to download and upload. Like many people, I'm working from home just now and my upload speeds are not that great. So things like that are taking a long time. Again, in an ideal world, Gorilla might have a feature that it can extract the naming latencies like Cronset does. So again, it wouldn't require necessarily using a third party. But that's something for me to add to the roadmap and make a suggestion, I'm sure. So yeah, generally I found this, the amount of data I've generated in the last few months is, it would take months before to run one of these studies. And we're running multiple studies now that can take days to a few weeks. So the level of data I'm generating now it's made a huge difference. And I'm, like I said earlier, I'm really confident that what we're finding in terms of data quality is very similar to what we would find with our lab-based studies. So just want to quickly thank I've got currently funded by the Carnegie Trust, and I'd just like to thank my collaborator who's worked on most of these projects, Dr. Mathieu de Klerk, and also just to thank Gorilla and the support that I've had along the way, because I wouldn't have been able to get all these up and running without that sort of community to keep answering all the questions I had. So I'm very grateful to the community and the staff that are always there to answer a question, no matter how silly it is. So
thank you ever so much, Neil. That's wonderful. Now in the chat, can you guys tell me, what did you find useful about that? I mean, a couple of things The idea of, the templates, for example, and being able to quickly clone projects. Is that something you guys find useful? Things about not sharing equipment and using participant equipment. I loved your kind of scoring system. It looked like you used Gorilla not just to collect your data, it also looked like you used Gorilla to score your data as well, which I thought that was great. Yeah, I've just seen someone else saying that using Gorilla to code it, scoring audio data online is really neat. Yeah, absolutely. Keep telling us in the chat what you found useful about that, and what. Yeah, we're going to come back to some of these questions a bit later on. I want to jump now over to Emma. So Emma, great to hear from you now.
Sure. Let me just figure out how to share my screen. So I've moved rooms and I've got better internet connection, but I have a worse setup, so I haven't done all the normal technical checks that I would do. But
it's looking good, coming across great.
You can see my screen, and now can you see my slides? Okay,
perfect.
Great. So yeah, hi everyone. As I mentioned before, I'm not a speech researcher exactly, but a language researcher. So I'm really interested in how we learn new words and how well we remember them, embed them in our vocabulary so that we can use them later on down the line. So I actually moved to online testing quite a while ago, back at the beginning of my PhD, mainly initially due to laziness. So because I look at language learning and memory, a typical experiment will involve me teaching participants new words. But then I want to see how many they've learned. Then I'll also want to see how well they remember them. So I might test them again the next day, and again a week later, maybe a month later as well. So that means constantly trying to get participants back into the lab, scheduling lots of sessions, which obviously my time is limited in how many people I can test at once. And also for the participants as well, dragging them all the way back onto campus, back into the department, sometimes just for kind of a 5 or 10 minute test is not really a very good use of their time either. The costs don't really kind of weigh up the extent of the effort that they have to go to. So initially I started moving the memory tests online. So I would bring participants into the lab, do the training activities with them, but then send them away and say, please just do these tests, later today, do it tomorrow as well, and I'll arrange payment or credit at the end. So that worked pretty well. But then since then, there's lots of things have developed in terms of the infrastructure. So I was able to start moving all of the experiments online and recruiting online as well via Prolific, and also having better software to be able to host all those different tasks. So Gorilla really helped there as well. Initially, I was collecting just typed responses. So for adults, I wasn't too concerned. I would just teach them the new words and say, well, just type out whatever you think I taught you. And that was good enough. For children, we didn't always want to do that because spelling's a lot more variable. That's another source of variance that we didn't really want to have in the data. So I was still going to schools, still collecting that data in person, getting spoken responses. And initially, the differences didn't seem to matter, but eventually later on down the line, we reached experiments and research questions where actually we didn't want to have those differences between children and adults. We wanted them to be doing exactly the same tasks and responding in exactly the same way. So this was about just over a year or so ago, and luckily Gorilla at the time was just developing their spoken recording response mode, going through beta testing at the time. So I was able to try this out and collect this spoken response study online as well. So just as a quick overview of what that experiment looked like. So we recruited via Prolific, and this was all programmed on Gorilla. This was a word learning experiment looking at how well we can learn new words from stories. So this was also run with children, hence they're very childlike cartoons. So we just had participants listen to stories, and there were these images on screen as well, just like having a story read to you as a child. And within these stories were, I think, 15 made up novel words. And then we wanted to see how well they'd learn those words just from listening and hearing them in the story. So we tested them immediately after they'd heard the story, the next day, and 1 week later. We had 3 types of tasks. 2 were multiple choice tasks, so I don't need to talk about them today, but one of them was this spoken task. So we gave them a cue for the start of the new word. So if the new word was Desta, we cued them with the sound de, and we asked them to try and produce the rest of the word that they'd learned. And I had a much easier job than lots of other people on the panel. I was just interested in accuracy. So could they accurately have a go at saying what the new word was? So I didn't need to worry about timing or anything like that. And generally speaking, the data worked out pretty well, actually a lot better than I expected. So I had an exclusion criteria that if any participant didn't have responses for more than 2 of the 3 sessions, then they would be excluded. So I lost 1 participant who we didn't have any recordings for. Out of the rest, nearly 99% of my trials were scoreable. I was able to say whether they were correct or incorrect. There would have been a few that wouldn't have had that with timing or anything like that, but for accuracy, it was generally pretty good. And yeah, I lost fewer trials than I expected to. So how did I get to that point? So my top tips for setting up something similar would be to make sure to have a microphone check at the very start of the experiment. So at least when I was running this study, there wasn't an easy way of sort of screening on Prolific for having a microphone set up. And this was a crucial part of the experiment. And so I did have this, the very first thing that participants arrived at was a microphone check, because we don't collect any data from that. It's just, is your microphone working? Is it compatible with the experiment? And are you happy to have your voice recorded in this experiment? And if it didn't work, then most of them just returned themselves to Prolific, and that wasn't a problem. So that way, you know, it got that kind of out of the way before they'd wasted their time going through all the rest of the experiment details. Second thing that I found quite helpful to do was to create a reference file. So at the start of every task, I then took my own recording that wasn't dependent on their performance in the experiment. It didn't need them to remember anything. I just asked them to speak, take me to the task. It's just something silly, which meant that I could go through those files quite quickly and say, yep, I can hear that person. Yep, I can hear that person. And although, of course, once they've got through the experiment, you know, I'd probably have to still pay them anyway, even if I didn't have any accessible recordings. It just meant that I could whiz through that quickly and address any issues on Prolific kind of before it was too far down the line to recontact the participant. It just meant I could say, oh, well, there's some issues, and kind of make sure that we had that kind of well documented. And also, it's actually really nice to listen to. I think recruiting via Prolific had all these wonderful accents from all corners of the UK, and it was quite nice hearing people sound so enthusiastic. My third, and actually probably the most important piece of advice, this probably only is relevant for kind of learning and memory experiments, but that's to try and avoid blank files. So a recording that has no one speaking on it is very hard to judge whether it's a technical problem or whether they just don't know and have skipped it. So to try and avoid this, I asked participants to, well, I always encourage them to have a go if they could, but otherwise to just speak pass or don't know. They weren't bad at this. Some were better than others. And I think if I was running the study again, I would kind of keep a reminder on screen to say, please always say something, because it's so much quicker to score if you don't have to try and sit there and go, can I hear something? Like, is it working or is there a technical problem? And the last one is actually to just be realistic. I don't know about other people's experiences with this. It sounded like Neil had some interesting experiences with backgrounds of sound files, but you know, it's not a lab environment. I think we all know from working from home that there will always be unanticipated interruptions, things beyond our control, the doorbell goes, you have kids in the next room screaming, you have a roommate who's watching TV, that might not be affecting you, but it might be being picked up on the microphone. And at the end of the day, it's just not a lab environment, and it's worth thinking about how much that matters for your research question. For me, so long as they were paying attention to the task, that was what mattered. And if I think about collecting data in schools, it's exactly the same. I can hear screaming children in the background and it's very normal. But I think it's important to think about whether that matters for your particular questions and how you'll deal with it if you can hear somebody else in the background or some other kind of noise. And I think that's me done. I'll pass over.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emma. Let us know, what did you find useful there in the top tips? Tell us in the chat. Actually, Emma, if you could bring your slides back up, that last slide of the top tips for us, and keep that on the screen. There was one, I can see one message in the chat, and I think it'd be great to clarify this. What exactly was the difference between the reference file and the microphone test?
Oh, yes. Hang on, I think I've just... Now you can see my screen, right?
We're back.
Yeah. So the microphone test, the way it's, at least it was, I think it still is, set up on Gorilla. It's the one that's built into the response mode, and it asks participants to speak, and it plays it back to them. So during that, no data is collected. We don't get any recordings from those files, and it lets them do it again and again just to try and get it working with the browser and make sure that the settings are correct. Whereas the reference file was collecting data, it did take a recording for me, and it meant that I had on record that their microphone was working, and that therefore any blank files hopefully weren't then a technical problem, but just them not responding.
No, I think that, yeah, thanks for clarifying that. That makes absolutely perfect sense now. I love it. There was one question in the Q&A as well. Yes, somebody did ask, this microphone check, was it executed in Prolific? Or this was done without avoiding those without a working mic coming to be a paid participant in Gorilla? Or this was within Gorilla, these mic checks and things, right?
It was within Gorilla. I mean, that's my wish list, is to have it embedded in Prolific so that you don't do that, because it is a bit difficult. Participants, obviously, if they're eligible for a study in Prolific, will want to take part. And another way to do this would be to have some kind of pre-screening experiment first, and then only invite eligible participants back. That's also an option. But yeah, at the moment, this was a case of just having it at the start in Gorilla and asking participants to be honest. And if their microphone didn't work, please don't take part in the experiment, because I'm very poor. So yeah.
Exactly. Thank you, Emma, for that. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on now, and we're going to have a chat with Abby and hear about Abby's work. Don't forget, guys, we are going to do a Q&A session at the end of this, so there's going to be plenty of opportunity. I can see some questions coming up in the Q&A box. There's going to be plenty of time to cover these before the end of today. But I'm not sure as well, some of the questions, if any of our panel wants to start getting onto those Q&A questions. I think, Neil, there's been a couple questions for you, particularly about your reaction time latencies. I'm not sure if you wanted to, have a go and type a couple answers for people there. That'd be really great. And yeah, Abby, it'd be great to hear from you now.
Great. Just get my slides up. Hopefully you can see that.
Yep, we're good.
Brilliant. So the project that I've been using the Gorilla audio recording zone for over the past few months has been interested in how speakers use and modulate their voices in different situations. So I've been quite ambitious, I think, because of COVID, in trying to actually extract some acoustic measures from audio recordings collected online. Specifically, I've been looking at extracting voice fundamental frequency, or the pitch, of speech productions. And I'm interested in how speakers might change the pitch of their speech in order to become more similar to the pitch of other voices that they're interacting with. And I've been looking at that in the context of what's known as choral speech, which is speaking in synchrony with another speaker. So to do that in Gorilla, I set up a task where I was audio recording participants while they read a series of sentences, firstly just on their own in a solo reading task, and then in synchrony with another voice, a pre-recorded voice that they heard over headphones. And I was interested in looking at how speakers might change the pitch of their speech productions between these two tasks in order to start sounding more similar to the pitch of the voice that they were hearing. And what we found, in fact, was that did seem to be the case. So when speakers were synchronizing with an unusually high-pitched voice, they tended to increase the pitch of their own speech productions, but they tended to decrease their pitch when synchronizing with a low-pitched voice. And in a second experiment, we found that these pitch changes weren't seen when just synchronizing with silent videos of another talker speaking, suggesting that this was some kind of true convergence to the other voice. So to show you what that looked like in Gorilla, this is the screen where we had this would have been the written sentence on screen the participant had to read, and this is our audio recording zone. And these are the settings we had for that. So you can see here we set it so that the audio recording automatically began on the screen start, and the screen only advanced once the recording had finished. We played around a bit here with whether the screen should advance based on the recording or based on when the audio sentence of the other voice had finished playing. But really we found that it was important to do this based on when the recording had finished, to avoid any kind of clipping off the end or problems with saving. I think in general, it's good practice if your design allows to use that setting. And lastly, you can see down the bottom here, we also use the option to transcode the audio files to MP3. So something to watch out for is that Gorilla automatically gives you your audio recordings as .web files or .weber files, which I didn't find a very helpful file format. And also because our audio recordings were just quite long, they were each 8 seconds long, they were really big files as .weber files, which took a long time to be uploaded by Gorilla. So when participants clicked to finish this task and move on to the next one, there was a really big delay as Gorilla was trying to upload these massive audio files. Whereas if we transcoded to MP3 as we went along, actually this resulted in smaller files, which Gorilla could much more happily save as it went. So we found that worked well for us. So a word on data quality, which I think is going to come up a lot this evening. So all in all, I have to say I was really pleasantly surprised at the success that I was able to achieve online, and the fact that for many participants we got good quality audio recordings that we were able to do pitch tracking in. But it's fair to say that we did have to lose a lot of data, and there were many participants for whom you know, we could hear them speaking, but they might have had background noise, all the things that have been mentioned already, which for us, because we're looking at acoustic measures, was really a big problem for our pitch tracking. So to give you an idea of that, in this plot, each square is a participant, and the red ones are the ones where we had unusable audio recordings, and that equated to 18 out of a total of 128 participants recruited across our studies. So when thinking about the quality of the audio recordings that you can get online, and if you're interested in kind of looking at acoustic and phonetic analyses, you do need to think really carefully about the measures that those online audio recordings are able to support. So for us, we decided to just focus on voice fundamental frequency, on pitch, because we were fairly confident that that would be robustly measured, even in maybe perhaps slightly poorer quality recordings. But we steered away from looking at other measures that we would have been interested in, such as the other formant frequencies, F1 and F2, because we just weren't confident that these could be reliably measured from online audio recordings. And there have been a few recent studies on this. In particular, I found there's a really helpful preprint from Chelsea Sanker and colleagues from Yale, where they actually compared across a range of different online sort of video conferencing softwares and different devices, and looked at extraction of acoustic and phonetic measurements using those different technologies. And their findings have sort of confirmed our intuitions that measurement of fundamental frequency seems to be fairly robust, but some of the higher formant frequencies in particular do suffer. So you just have to be aware of potential limits at the moment of the types of acoustic analyses that you can do. So a summary of some of my top tips. I'm just going to skip over this first one because I think we might revisit this in the questions later. I would recommend you include, if you're interested in acoustic and phonetic analyses, include a debrief at the end of your task that asks participants to report what their recording setup was, in particular, so what device are they using? Are they using an external microphone or a microphone internal to the laptop? It's just really useful to document potential variability across your participants. And then you can also potentially use that as a random effect in your analyses to check for any effects of that variability. Even better than that, try and keep recording setup as similar as possible across your participants. Again, this is really important for acoustic and phonetic analyses. So you can do that when you're recruiting participants. You can limit them to only use a laptop, so you don't really want to be mixing recordings taken on phones with recordings taken on laptops, and the same browser even is a good thing to do. So really a big no-no for phonetic analyses is to take some people, record some people using Zoom and some people using Gorilla, and then try and sort of compare them or mash them together, you'll run into lots of problems. For data analysis, it's best if you're comparing phonetic and acoustic measures within subjects. So for example, in our study, we were always looking at relative changes in pitch within participants during solo reading and choral speech, which meant that we were just holding constant that potentially confounding factor of recording setup. And do be aware that there are, particularly a lot of the video conferencing software apps do actually employ filtering of the acoustic signal, so particularly of higher frequencies, to try and filter out background noise. But this can actually have disruptive effects on the speech signal itself and distort some of your phonetic measures, particularly to do with fricative sounds. If you're interested in those, that can be a big problem. So in general, from what I've read, it seems like Zoom might not be such a good thing to use if you're interested in acoustic and phonetic measures. For what it's worth, Gorilla, the audio recording zone itself, doesn't employ any kind of filtering or algorithms like this. It's just going off the default parameters within the browser. So in theory, it might be better, but I don't have data to support that at the moment. That's something I'd really like to look into more. So I'm going to finish there. I've just put a QR code here for this preprint that I mentioned previously that I just found really helpful. There's a lot of recommendations and more technical information on there as well, if you want to check that out.
Amazing. Thank you, Abby. Fantastic. Tell us in the chat, which of those top tips did you find most useful? Was it the debrief? Was it the setup? Was it the analysis? Or was it filters? So right, debrief, setup, analysis, or filters to let us know which things you found most useful about that. I'm seeing a lot for debrief and filters, definitely. The filter thing's very interesting, actually. Yeah. I wouldn't have been aware from that. Yeah, debrief, a lot of people as well. We had this last month when we did our eye tracking webinar as well. You know, the simplest, the qualitative things are sometimes the most powerful. Having really good videos. So Jens, one of our speakers, talked about basically beards and essentially telling participants, ask a participant if they want to shave. I mean, it's a ridiculous thing, but there's things that, especially the more serious ones actually were about things like lighting, making sure that, you've got backlight or front-feeding lighting rather than backlighting going into the camera. So yeah, don't underestimate the power of a good debrief. In the interest of time, Roger, we can go to you. That'd be wonderful.
Thank you. Let me just set it up. Yeah, I just quickly want to shout out Anne Vogt, my co-author, who actually was the scheduled panelist, but she's unfortunately taken ill, and get well soon, Anna. And I'd also like to thank Anna Kuhn and Rashad Abderrahman for their supervision and support in the study. So get right into it. So when labs shut down initially, we weren't very optimistic that we could continue conducting speech production research using speech onset latencies as our dependent variables. And we quickly remembered an old study by Rashad Abderrahman, where they actually replicated the semantic interference effect in the picture-word interference, both in an overt naming task, but also in a manual response classification task. And so we thought, well, okay, so this could be an alternative to our response latencies. But then we did come across some custom JPsych implementations of trial-by-trial audio recording, and we thought, well, even better, we could kind of combine these two in the same study and use the manual response latencies, where we don't really have any reason to doubt the timing accuracy, to kind of validate our custom audio approach. And we did this in the picture-word interference paradigm, where participants are presented with target pictures, and they need to name the target pictures, but there are written distractor words that are either semantically related or unrelated. So in this case, it would be semantically related distractors, where typically naming latencies are longer than in the unrelated condition. And so we combined this where they actually had to produce the target television, or they would just classify the last letter of the target as a vowel or consonant. So we did this like I said, with a custom audio recording implementation in JSpsych, and we also implemented the button press task in JSpsych, and it was a counterbalanced order of tasks in the same participants all did both tasks. And we, because JSpsych is only the experimental platform, we used another tool called JTOS for the backend and hosting of the experiment, and at a local server at Hauber. And then, similar to Neil's studies, we also use Cronset to actually extract the speech onset latencies from our data from the single. So we had 80 files per participant. It's a lot of files. And we actually did use a custom Bradshaw script where, while we were coding for correctness anyway, we also did correct manually the latency if it was obviously off. For example, sometimes Cronset would just simply not produce any onset, and then we actually did manually correct that. And then we applied linear mixed models for both the latency data from the button press task and the verbal naming task, and we actually set up nested models to sort of estimate separately the effect of relatedness in both tasks. And in our first run of the experiment, we only found a marginally significant effect in the overt naming task, and these data were not outlier corrected because we hadn't pre-registered any form of outlier correction. And when we, in exploratory analysis, when we actually did correct for outliers, we realized that the results actually improved. And so we decided to run a second experiment where we pre-registered separately and did pre-register outlier correction. And we also adapted because we're also experiencing some excessive trial loss and therefore losses of whole participants, because we had a cutoff of if the trial loss exceeded 20%, we would just leave out the entire participant. And actually, most participants struggled with the button press task. Apparently, the instructions were just maybe not so clear. They kept classifying the letter of the distractor, which maybe is kind of understandable because it was written and it's just. So we also adapted the instructions and made it very explicit that they should please not classify the distractor, but rather the target. And in the second experiment, we also sampled from our HU internal participant pool, which we usually use for our lab experiments, which, well, are typically psychology students, but yes, and in the second experiment, we were able to replicate the semantic interference effect in both tasks. And we could, our approach was that while we can't really say if how precise our timing actually is in the audio recordings, it is apparently sufficiently precise to replicate an effect that is, while it's robust, it's not very large. It's typically 20 to 30 milliseconds. So we were able to replicate that effect, and this led us to some recommendations or top tips, if you will. We need to account for increased noisiness of data when we're dealing with online data. So, like others have mentioned as well, within participant designs, especially because it uses different machines and internet connection and all, such things, and also some sort of outlier correction is probably necessary to account also for that noise. And compared to lab studies, we would recommend increasing sample size and probably even specifically increase the number of trials you do per participant. We've done some preliminary post hoc power analyses simulating models with the parameter values that we had in our models, and it actually does seem like increasing trials by, say, 50% has a much larger effect on power than increasing sample size by 50%, which, because of because of noisiness within participants, apparently makes sense that maybe trials, increasing trials. Oh, sorry, increasing trials might actually be more important, which is kind of at odds with keeping the experiments short. But yeah, and another important recommendation, I think, is to avoid excessive data loss. We need to be very clear and precise in our instructions, especially because participants simply cannot ask another question if something is unclear. The experiment just keeps going. And also, in the same vein, provide some practice trials where we give ample and explicit feedback within the experiment if they're doing it correctly, and also include some sort of catch trials, vigilance trials to ensure that participants are actually paying attention. Yeah, and I'll bring that up again right now, but first, thanks to you, and you can find all the material, data, and code at the OSF, and you can also find the preprint here. But
Thank you, Roger. Thank you so much. I'm just going to jump into, we're a bit running out of time, so I just want to jump into a couple of questions that we've got. And I think these questions, I think a few people have alluded to, and this idea of essentially naming latencies. How reliable do you guys think naming latencies are? Roger, I want to start actually with you and your opinion on that.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like I said, apparently they're reliable enough to replicate effects that aren't huge, that are 20 to 30 milliseconds large. And so while there might be some imprecision, apparently aggregated across participants and within participants across trials, we can apparently reliably measure onset latency. So I would say it's reliable enough, and leave it at that.
And how does the rest of the panel feel? I guess, would you concur? Or do we have some slightly different opinions? Or
I would agree. I have found the whole experience to be pleasantly surprising. How much, like I've sort of indicated, I would keep doing this research online, or even if I was back in the lab with some level of control, I would still use these systems. So I've been very impressed by, I guess, the quality. And yeah, I think that I'm comparing it to the kind of data that we would get previously. That's kind of my benchmark. So nothing sort of more complex than that, but we're finding similar effects and similar magnitudes of effects. So for me, that's kind of what I'm happy to see that.
No, that's great. Something that I think each of you touched upon, although it seemed to be quite different, was to do with rejection criteria. And actually, I've seen something, I think it was in the last week, I've seen some comments on Twitter a bit about this as well, and about rejection criteria for online research. I guess starting with you, Abby, what would you recommend as your kind of, expected thresholds? Let's call it that.
What do you mean by expected threshold? Sorry.
So, in terms of data loss and setting, and kind of an expected level of accuracy to include participants, what would you kind of set as your outlier criteria?
As in scoring accuracy in responses, or?
Yeah, well, just in terms of, I think, I'm trying to remember, in your presentation, I think, didn't you mention you lost about 20%?
Yeah, so kind of, so we've all been using slightly different criteria, I guess, because we're using slightly different measures. So for me, I wasn't measuring whether participants' responses were accurate, but I was interested in whether I could get reliable pitch tracking from their responses. So really, it was just a case of going through each of the individual audio recordings, listening to them, and on a trial by trial basis, deciding whether there was too much background noise. I mean, it was very clear kind of to see, from listening to the first few trials, this participant has the washing machine in the background, and I could actually get up the audio recording in. So I use Praat software for my pitch tracking. So I did a lot of individual checking of trials to check that the pitch of just the speech was being picked up by Praat, and it wasn't picking up anything in the background. So if there were any concerns with background noise, I sort of manually really checked the pitch tracking. But generally, I was quite strict. If there was any kind of background noise, it had to be a lost data set, really. Whereas I imagine for some other people like Emma, where you're just interested in coding, did they say the right word or not? It doesn't matter if you can hear the washing machine in the background, as long as you can tell, you can code whether that was correct or not. So yeah, it really depends on what you're interested in.
So I guess the key point then to take away from that is, I guess, if you're using speech as a way to find the right answer, then you seem to really be able to keep most people, but when you need those, say, phonetic features, or if there's something about, I guess as well, with when it comes to latencies or some kind of speech feature, that's when you're obviously going to have a much stricter criteria. And I think would you say across you guys, you were losing, say, something like 20-30% of kind of sound?
Yeah, so I think not just in terms of losing reaction times, but things like the accuracy criteria. We have recovery trials. If somebody makes a mistake, we also exclude the trial after. So taking all our criteria into consideration, I think it's about 20 to 25% I'm seeing for most studies. So it's just something to factor into the kind of power analysis now. We're kind of hitting those figures fairly consistently, that range. So.
No, that's great to hear. So I just want to start, I'm conscious of the time, so I just want to wrap up now, and I'd just like to get an idea from each of you, kind of where you think the future goes for this kind of speech production research online, and what you would like to see in the future. I'd like to start with you, Roger. What would you like to see? What do you think the future is?
Yeah, in an ideal world, because the kinds of studies that we originally planned to do was actually kind of speech production in social settings, where still in a lab, but partner experiments, shared task settings. And that's obviously even more difficult now than, getting two strangers into a lab is even less of a good idea probably than getting one person to a lab. So if it were possible to have online studies of two speakers at the same time, that would be great. In an ideal world, that would work wonders.
Yeah. Abby, I'll ask you the same question.
Yeah, definitely echo the two speakers thing. That would be really cool, definitely, to look at. So, I started this kind of project trying to look at acoustic and potentially phonetic measures in online speech recordings quite tentatively, and I'm not 100% sure that we're there yet in order to sort of do everything that I'd want to look at. As I said, in some ways I did feel quite restricted having to just focus on pitch, which I was very confident we were able to track well in these recordings, but going forward, it would be great to be able to have the confidence to explore other acoustic and phonetic measures. So I think we're not there yet in knowing how we can try and improve the quality in order to look at those. Some things might be, I've definitely heard of some people, I think, actually sending participants in the post external microphones that they can put into their laptops to try and do better recordings, but you really are limited by just the quality of the microphone that participants have at home. So yeah, I think I'm a bit tentative about how fast we will be able to do these kind of phonetic analyses online, but let's hope we get there at some point.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. Emma, how about you?
Well, I think my wish is actually very simple. I think having a small step towards speech recognition. So not in the sense that, I don't think it would ever be able to code my weird made up words that I've made up, and that people have spent ages going, it was something like so and so. No, that's not going to happen. But an element of speech, of voice recognition and speech recognition in a check, a microphone check, so that the software knows that the participant's microphone is working well enough to recognize their voice, to say, yeah, they can go onwards and completely experiment. So something like that.
That sounds wonderful. And Neil?
Kind of relates to that in a sense. I've got this kind of dream of somehow kind of gamifying some of these types of experiments, because recruitment can be difficult, and obviously money is a great motivator, but you don't always have funding to pay people. So maybe making it a bit more enjoyable, or a bit more kind of engaging for them. But again, I think that might require to an extent some kind of speech recognition to give live feedback to them and things like that. But yeah, that's definitely where I would love to see this kind of stuff end up, just implement it into some MMORPG somehow and get like masses of data would be wonderful. So
I think that sounds amazing.
that's my dream.
I love the gamification idea. That sounds fantastic. I think that's a lovely positive way to end it, thinking about games. Thank you everyone for joining us today for this Gorilla Presents. Can you please just say in the chat a big thank you to all of our speakers. It's been wonderful hearing everything you've had to say today. Wonderful top tips. This is going to be, this recording is going to go online. So all of you who've registered, I'll be sending you a link. So you'll be able to watch this. Hopefully from Monday, you'll be able to watch this again if you want to catch up. We're not doing Gorilla Presents next month, but instead, in 2 months' time, you've got Be Online, our 2 half-day conferences, and we're going to cover lots of things there, including actually games and games in research. We've got a big section on gaming research if you're interested in that. So thank you again for joining us. Go to the Be Online website and sign up for that. You can still submit abstracts if you want to present something too. And we'll see you all hopefully at Be Online at the height of the summer. And thank you, everyone. Bye, everyone. Cheers. Thank you.